You're watching Into Wine TV. Today we're up in Sonoma and we're talking about the influence of the points and rating system of wine. Now, Robert Parker has made famous the 100-point wine scale. Question is, does it empower people? Does it change the quality of wines being produced? Michael, what are your thoughts on wine rankings and what may be some other alternatives?
As a wine writer myself, I don't rank wines by points. I understand what Robert Parker has done, and I appreciate that as a springboard to discovering wines. My frustration is that anytime you give a point system to something, whether it's wine or a car or anything else, people take that as law. And really, the 100-point system is no longer a 100-point system; it's a 20-point system because no one looks at wines under that 80-point mark. So all we look at is what received, 90 to 96, and that's what we want. It's a fine tool, but I find that tool has been misused because the public is not really allowed to think for themselves about how they want to appreciate wine and learn about it. When I write about wines, I do recommend, I do suggest. When I was on my radio show, I would certainly say, here's a great wine, price commensurate with quality, if you will. But I would never give it 5 stars or 100 points, anything like that, because I find personally that demeans the product. And it distills everything down to a matter of a few points. And I think the more we do that, the more the public gravitates towards that and does not think for themselves. They just go, 92 points, I'll buy it.
I think that's the major argument against it, and I do use the 100-point scale. I think it's become entrenched in America, and one's pretty much forced to use it. It works well in communicating a sense of the wine as compared to other wines of the same type.
What do you mean by that? What kinds of things does it communicate and teach?
It communicates in the sense
consumer?
that those of us who grew up in the American educational system are really familiar with 100 points in terms of our papers being graded or exams. We know where an A, a B, and C fall. I mean, we could probably just as easily use A, B, C and subgrades of that, but the 100-point scale is really easy for people to understand. It's a lot easier for us to understand in America than the British 20-point scale that they're really stuck on. I have to translate and do math all the time and still wonder if I'm getting it just right.
But wine tasting is so subjective. So how do you turn
It's absolutely subjective,
taste
but there are
numbers?
thousands and thousands of wines out there, and consumers need some help in navigating. They don't have the time that some of us who spend a lot of time in the industry and tasting have to sample lots of wines. They want some basic guidance as to what might be worth their $20 or $15 or more, hopefully.
But unfortunately, we have now a built-in reliance on this point system. I talk to people all the time, some of whom will not buy anything under 85 points because that's a bad wine. There are some fabulous wines that would not be rated 80 points or above that are still out there. What I try to advocate when I write is to talk about the wine a little bit in depth and say, either as a recommendation or a strong recommendation, but to say buy, don't buy, is certainly an ego boost for writers, and we want to be the kind of people who say, get it, it's good, as opposed to, well, make up your own mind, because people are looking for direction. But I find that the 100-point system does not allow people much to explore. They just go with a number and they're done.
And we need to do more education about that, because there are fabulous wines in the high 80s. I'm not so sure about the low 80s, but it does pain me as a critic to give a wine that I really love, that I'm having a great time with, that goes beautifully with a meal. I know in terms of quality compared to other things and complexity that, it fits in my subjective sense more at an 89 or 88 point level. I'm loving the wine. I try and indicate that like you do in terms of the notes that I write and how I tell the story of the wine.
Yeah.
But I think it's a useful discipline to give it some sort of ranking of some kind. I did it before I really got heavily involved in criticizing wine, and it is a discipline, but it forces you to sort of compare experiences and try and figure out why it is that a particular wine deserves a higher score, what makes it
and
special.
by way of example, that 1 point can be a big deal. So to me, when we talk about wine and we suggest that someone buy a wine, you can recommend or suggest or have a strong recommendation. That's different than a wine being 89 points to 90 points. That one tick can make a huge difference for people. And that's what frustrates me is 1 point on or off, however someone ranks it, can mean that a wine may not get purchased, as opposed to someone saying, I strongly recommend that you buy this wine, which is a pretty vague term, but it also gives more leeway for people to make up their own mind.
Partly as a result of that, I mean, we've had serious grade inflation, if you want to call it that. one of the leading critics that I think we'll probably refer to a number of times, who certainly has popularized the 100-point scale. He's known for getting a lot of attention by saying this is the wine of, this particular region, experience, the wine of the decade. I'm giving lots of
This is the great inflation you're talking about.
Great inflation, and that's gotten people conditioned that, why am I going to buy a 92-point wine or a, whatever, I should hold out for these 100-point wines. It gets absurd.
Yeah.
But I think now that there are a lot more critics out there, we've got something like Cellar Tracker, which is the largest compendium of tasting notes anywhere, and that forces people, if you want to be able to compare your scores with anybody else, to use the 100-point scale. One can start get ratings there which are based on large numbers of people tasting, and there tends to be a certain wisdom in large numbers of people. I think that's been shown through a lot of studies. So you're not depending on just one critic and their subjective view anymore. You're looking at wide range. You can get a number that's a little more suggestive, and hopefully reading the notes as well, to see whether this is something you want to take.
That's a very important point, because I'll never forget the time in the .com era where I was at a friend's house for a dinner party, a big, fairly large dinner party, and I saw two friends that I knew chatting, huddled together, and one was a venture capitalist, and one was a successful .com guy, and I went over to them. These guys will remain nameless because they both went into the wine business and neither of their companies did particularly well. But I remember going up to them and they were talking about this wine that they had, and they said, "Come." I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Oh, it's a great wine. It's 92 points from Parker." And so I took the glass and smelt it, and it was completely corked. And I said, "This is corked," and they looked at me quizzically, and my wife was walking past, and she's got the best nose for corked wines in the whole world. And I grabbed her and said, "What do you think of this?" And she smelled it and said, "Oh, it's corked." And these two guys, they were going by score. They weren't, if they'd read the review of it, they'd have thought, well, how come it doesn't taste the way it's written? But they had no clue. And
Score blind.
Yeah, I find actually scores pretty useful. I mean, I think Parker did a good thing bringing scores into it. It's helped in some ways.
But it needs to evolve.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a great, as I said, it was a great springboard, but now it needs to evolve into something else, and something that's more user-friendly for the public.
Well, whether it's a 100-point score or the 20-point system, which is in England, as you say, mostly, and my father's own 5-star system, it's kind of like a movie critic. If you get to know a movie critic and you see that he likes a particular movie, you're not going to like it. You don't bother because you know his taste. And likewise, you might slam a movie and you go and see it because it's going to be a great movie. Similarly, there are some critics, if they score a wine 95 points or above, I'm likely to not want to taste that wine because...
Well, but that's also a result of the system that's not working properly. I review restaurants in Santa Barbara, so we use a star system, so we use 5 stars or 4 stars. But there are the restaurant is graded on food and on service and on multiple things. So when you get that end score, and I admit that that's what I do with the paper, it's a compilation of different things, as opposed to wine, which is 85 points or 92. And I know it's a little more difficult, but it would be, I think, advantageous if we could score a wine based on several different categories, and then you can have an overall score so people can say, oh, well, I like this one aspect of the wine.
So I disagree that the point system, whatever one is using, is the problem. I think the big problem with the 100-point system in California was that we were so dominated by one critic. And it was his points that became almost gospel for a lot of people. Now that we have more of a variety of critics, now we have something like Cellar Tracker where, 100 people can weigh in on the wines based on their point system, and you can get an average that
you can't blame Robert Parker for that because it's not, he's actually got a very consistent palate. It has changed over time, but it's consistent. But it's not him who decided to make himself mega powerful. Right. It's the wineries who all quoted him and found it was useful, having 100 points or sold wines.
I think one can argue that. I think he took positions. He went out of his way to really ally himself with Bordeaux and their marketing system, and they turned him into basically a god among critics for a while. So I don't know. I think he made some choices that did help promote him.
He's still incredibly influential when it comes to Bordeaux, but
Yes.
Other regions, not necessarily. A big school doesn't necessarily sell wine.
So he's very influential on consumers. What about winemakers who are making wines to achieve a certain number? Is that something that
I talk to winemakers all the time, some of whom would never admit this in public, but they specifically chase those scores, and I've been told by owners and winemakers that they make their wine specifically to achieve a certain rating.
There's also been the evidence of laboratories which sell the formulas to wineries, and so they can make
Absolutely.
they can design a wine to get a specific score.
2 or 3 of them now that have done enough with algorithms and the various chemical properties of a wine that basically they can predict the score within a point or two, which
Yeah, so I think
that's a smaller group. I mean, overall, winemakers are doing whatever they want to do because they want to make a wine a certain way, and that's the predominant. I don't mean to suggest that everybody's moving towards Robert Parker, but there is a small group of people that are willing to specifically make a wine for a point.
I'd like to separate wines based not on scores but on authentic, true wines versus manipulated commercial.
And there are critics that base their whole point system on that. John Gilman, for example, he's a real traditionalist. If you're a traditional style winemaker and true to the tradition, you're going to get huge points from him as compared to some of the ones that get big points from others who aren't sticking in the traditional style. There is a critic who's very influential in Burgundy who is seen as very, very conservative in his scores, hardly ever gives anything over 95 points. So his small gradations, between 90 and 91, are hugely influential because he's respected both within Burgundy and by people who follow Burgundy.
Well, it sounds like the point system is useful in a lot of ways, but in others it can be a little bit questionable on whether that's impacting consumer behavior positively or negatively. Share us your thoughts on our website. And we hope to hear from you soon, and we'll see you next time on IntoWineTV.